Hi class, it's Dr. Jim. In this lecture we're going to be looking at the evolution of the green plant or evolution of the plants in general. And so what we're going to do is take a little bit of a journey today in this lecture and kind of look at how plants evolved from the green algae. Now next week we're actually going to talk a little bit about the algae and that with the protozoa and the slime molds as part of the protista kingdom, and we're going to look at those guys next week. But we have to kind of understand what the plants are since we're talking about plants this week, and it's kind of mixing in the different weeks and that stuff. And so what we're going to look at is how the plants came about from the evolution of the green algae. And then, like I said, next week what you're doing is going to look at what green algae is. But you can see that it's a very simplistic plant. It's a multicellular organism that tends to have green pigments in it and it photosynthesizes. What plants are ones that have very developed systems. They have vascular systems, they have leaves, they have stems, and they have roots. And so we're going to see some of the differences. And so even though we're talking about plants this week, next week we'll look at the protists and you'll see some of the differences that we're going to talk about. But it's important to know the two and what we're looking at. So anyways, let's begin our journey by looking at what we're going to accomplish today in this lecture. The first thing we're going to look at is how and why did the plants evolve from their green algae relatives. And so we still have algae today. We still talk about algae quite a bit in this day and age, and especially where we have these things called algae blooms. And you may have heard about the thing that happened in Toledo, Ohio a couple months ago with the green algae in the Lake Erie, and it stopped them from being able to drink any of their water at that time from Lake Erie because of all the toxins that were produced. Now, green algae is a distant cousin to the plants, and we're going to see how plants actually evolved and why they evolved from the green algae, and basically what were the steps or what promoted that evolution from the algae to what we now see as trees and plants and other things like that. The second thing we're going to address is why the addition of a vascular system was very important to plants. So a vascular system like what we have, so think about the arteries and veins that we have going through our bodies. Well, plants have a very similar type of structure where they have xylem and phloem, and they are responsible for bringing things to and from the roots to the leaves and that stuff. Very important for these things to survive. Third thing we're going to look at is the development of seeds and flower, and why was that an important survival of plants. And so we're going to look at why this evolution to making seeds and then ultimately making flowers was really important in the evolution of these plants and what happens. And then finally, the last thing we're going to address are some of the differences between a monocot and dicot, or sometimes we'll refer to it as a eudicot, angiosperm. Now, angiosperms are the flowering plants, and we're going to learn more about them today. But I want to address that there are some subtle differences between the two types of angiosperms, and we're going to look at all those different things, and we'll look at some of the differences, and you can kind of think of roots, stems, leaves, and flowers for those things. And so think about those things, and that's what we're going to look at today. All right, so those are our objectives. So let's take a look at how the early evolution of green plants took place. Okay. So the evolution of green plants really started when green algae moved from the water and onto the land and evolved into green plants. So that was a big step. So this green algae, what you see here, and you've probably seen it before if you've ever been to a pond or some stagnant water, you've seen it floating on top of the water. We also look at some seaweeds and other things like that, the kelps, the weeds and that stuff. That's all green algae. And what you associate with algae is that you associate it being in water. Well, think about at the time when there was no plants on the planet, there were no animals on the land and that stuff. Algae was thriving in the water. There were lots of multicellular organisms in the water and that. But the next logical step was then moving on to dry land. Okay, what were some advantages to why you'd want to move on to dry land at that point? Well, some of the advantages of moving to land would be plentiful light for photosynthesis. You have to kind of think about it. You guys have been underwater, or most of you have been underwater before, and you know that light decreases as you go underneath the water. And so if you can be out of the water and be on top of the land, you have a lot more light in which you can be more successful at photosynthesis. The second thing is that carbon dioxide is more plentiful in the atmosphere, in the air, than it is in the water, because the carbon dioxide has to get diffused in the water. Very tough to do. So more carbon dioxide to be available for photosynthesis. So not only the light, but the carbon dioxide that you need. And so we've seen this before when we run our experiments with cellular respiration and photosynthesis. What were the two things you needed for photosynthesis? You needed baking soda water, which is the carbon dioxide, and you needed the green leaves and the light to actually get the leaf disc to float. And so those things were very important, and that was one of the advantages, or a couple of advantages, of going on the land. The problem, though, of moving onto land was this, is that, again, now you are moving away from the water. You need to have a source of water to still do those functions. Another very important thing in photosynthesis is water, and so you need to get water, and so you need to develop systems in order to get the water to the leaves where photosynthesis takes place. Okay? Another main thing that you can think about if you've ever swum in a pool. It's much lighter, much more relaxing. And if you do have an injury, a lot of times doctors suggest non-weight-bearing exercises, and a lot of times what they suggest is you do a workout in a pool. And what that does is the water removes the weight that you're putting on your body. So the water allows you to be, structurally heavier and not carry as much weight in the water. And so that was one of the problems with the plants moving out of the water, is that now they have to be able to support their weight without having water to support them for them. So making new structures and force support. And the last thing, which is probably something you don't think about, but reproduction is really a big issue when you move away from the water. Typically what we see in both animals and plants that use the water for reproduction is that basically they distribute their gametes in the water, and then hopefully they find each other somewhere in the water using the currents and then letting them meet and flowing out. Well, when you don't have water to put your gametes into, you need to have another system in which to spread both your sperm and your egg. And so you have to find new ways to do that without water. And so that's the other big disadvantage that you have. So there's a lot of advantages to moving on. The natural resources, the big issues with carbon dioxide and light, lots of good advantages. But then water is really your main restriction. Without that water, you're not going to be able to grow. So you have to culminate those two, the advantages versus the disadvantages. And that's what happened with plants, is that they basically made the movement going from green algae into plants. And we're going to look at this evolution and how this took place. Okay, so if we look at the green algae was the first, or the distant ancestor to the plants. And what happened? Well, basically, it was the first step coming out of the water. And so what we see is we saw these plants that have no vascular system but grow very low to the ground. And if I asked you, think of a plant that grows really close to the ground, you'd probably tell me grass. Well, that's not quite what I want. But if you think about some of the other plants like mosses, and sometimes we talk about hornworts and liverworts, you probably don't know what those are, but you do know what moss is. If you've ever seen a stone and seen moss, those are really the first plants to evolve from the green algae. Okay? The second step, which was probably the most important, was the development of a vascular system, making both veins and arteries of a plant, both the phloem and xylem of a plant, in order to grow tall. So the problem with the moss is they have to grow very close to the ground. They have to grow where water is still available with the ground. With vascular plants, you can get up off the ground and into the air, and that was even more important because the CO2, the light, and other things, the competition, getting away from those things. Then finally, the last evolution that took place with the plants was the evolution of seeds. So the organisms before this all use some type of spore to move their gametes around for sperm and egg. These guys in the last two groups, the Gymnosperms and the Angiosperms, actually use a form of a seed in order to spread both the sperm and egg. And so we're going to look at both these things today and why that made such an important advantage to these Gymnosperms and Angiosperms. And we're going to find out that the Angiosperms, the flowering plants, are the most abundant in this world. And we're going to see why that is. Okay? So that takes you through a brief evolution of what happened. Now I'm going to take you step by step, just show you some of these different plants and why we care about these things and why we should care about these things in our evolution and ecology. Okay? So the first one were the non-vascular plants. So think about moving on to land. You getting out of the water and moving on to land, and that's what these guys did. Most of the time they're pretty small. When you look at a moss and I tell you go find some moss, what you're going to find, they're going to be tucked in rocks and crevices and things like that. You're not going to be having these big explosions. Now in this one, this picture shows you a really big explosion of moss, but typically you see them very close to the ground, very wet areas, very close, and again, not very high off the ground. Okay, they have a leafy appearance. They don't have any true roots, stems, or leaves associated with them. And again, they lack any specialized transport mechanisms, no vascularity, no phloem, no xylem, and basically what they do is they absorb water through the plant itself. And so where you're going to find these things in very moist areas, areas that are going to be very close to the water, damp areas where we're going to grow, that's where you're going to see these mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. And so the mosses are included in this group, the liverworts, and then the hornworts as well. Okay, and you may have seen these before, may not, but I know you've all probably have seen moss somewhere in this world. And if you haven't, make sure you get out and look for some moss, look for some stones close to the ground, and you'll probably find some moss on them growing. All right, so that's the non-vascular plants. The first step of evolution coming out of the water, the next step I should say, coming out of the water was making a vascular system. And so the rest of the plants that we're going to be talking about today all have a vascular system, and that includes the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. And we're going to talk about what those things are in just a minute. Okay, it was basically due to the movement onto the land. And again, having a vascular system, this is their circulatory system. This allows them to move things throughout the plant, okay, bringing water from the roots to the leaves, and then the waste or the food from the leaves down to the roots, things like that, okay? Now, there are two types of vascular systems. There's the xylem, which transports water, and the easiest way that I remember it is I think X and I think W are very close together, so xylem moves the water. Okay, and then the phloem moves the nutrients, the sugars, and then the waste throughout the rest of the plant. And so you can think of that maybe sugar, S and P, sugars, and the phloem moving those things, or nutrients, something like that. And so they're both different systems that move throughout the plant. So think of the xylem moving the water and the phloem moving the nutrients, the sugars, and the waste throughout the rest of the plant. And you can see it includes the ferns, the gymnosperms, the angiosperms, and again, the phloem and xylem are the vascular system. What this ultimately allowed the plants to do is get off the ground. So if you remember me talking, mosses grow very close to the ground, very wet areas. What this vascular system does allows you to get off the ground, get up into the air, and grow very tall. Okay, and so we're going to see that the rest of these guys, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, can grow very, very tall off the ground because now they have a vascular system in which to get water from. Okay, so the first vascular plant is the seedless type, and these are the ferns. Now, ferns are typically, and you probably might even have some ferns at home. If you do, what I want you to do is when you get home, or maybe you're watching this at home, take a look at the bottom or flip over the fern, and what you're going to see are these little sori. These sori right here are the little pods for spores. So ferns don't have seeds, they have spores, which make them important. Now, parts of the ferns include, they have the roots, so they have a very shallow root system. They have these fiddleheads that look like these. These are going to be new ferns that are growing out of the ground, so they kind of started off curled up, and then they kind of flip out and spread out into like a big hand, like a fern plant. And then what we call the leaves, or the frond. The frond is basically the leaf part of the fern, okay? And like I said, underneath these leaf parts, which you're going to see on the bottom side of the fern or the frond, you're going to see these sori. And these sori are these little pockets where they produce the spores. And what happens is the wind comes by, grabs the spores, and pulls them into the wind, and then they can spread throughout. And that's basically what they do. So the spores are released, the spores get released into the air, and then they land in different spots and they grow into new ferns. Okay? So that's how ferns reproduce, by making spores. And we'll talk about plant reproduction later on in other lectures as well. Okay, so ferns use spores in this case. Now we get into the seeds. The seeds was the next major step of evolution. And the last two groups of plants that we're going to look at today are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The gymnosperms are the cone plants. So any plants that refer to cones, we call these conifers, or the cone bearers. Okay, conifers, you see cone in there. So that will be the clue, cone, or the cone bearers. That's what a conifer is. Okay, basically they now in those cones have seeds which give rise to new plants. Okay, they have true stems and roots. Their leaves are the needles, and then again they have a very tough waxy coating on them that protect them from drying out. That's one of the big issues without moving up and off the ground, is now you're moving away from the water. Well, you need a way to keep that water in, so you need a way to waterproof yourself. And so what they do is make a very waxy cuticle to keep the water in. What is included in this group? Well, we have the redwoods, the very tall redwoods. If you ever go to California, I highly recommend go to San Francisco. Just about 20 to 30 miles north of San Francisco. Not even that far. I mean, I think it's about 20 minutes north of San Francisco. You go to Redwood National Forest and see all the redwoods. They're beautiful, magnificent trees. Okay, very, very tall, very, very old. Other ones that you're probably familiar with in Wisconsin are all the pine trees that we have around here. All the different types of pines. They all make different types of cones and things like that, but those are all conifers. The last one, you'd think, oh, these are palm trees, but they're not. They're actually called syads, and syads are basically, they're palm-looking trees, but they actually have cones, and you can kind of see these things. And a lot of times you'll see these like in Mexico or maybe the Middle East or other places like that, and they're really the gymnosperms. They're not palm trees, which are actually angiosperms. So these are gymnosperms. When you see cones, that means conifer or gymnosperms. All right? So cones, what are cones? Well, cones are basically the way that the conifers reproduce. You have two types of cones in every conifer. You have the male cones, which contain the pollen, and they typically grow on the lower levels of the tree. Okay. You also have the female cones, which contain the eggs, and they get fertilized by the pollen. These cones are typically at the top of the pine tree. So the next time you go look out at a pine tree, look for these two types of cones. You'll see the male cones, and they tend to be smaller and skinnier in nature, and then you have the fatter, stumpier female cones, which tend to be at the top. So the male cones at the bottom, females at the top. And the reason for this is that wind will come in and blow the pollen from these cones, and they'll go and get trapped in the bigger cones from the female. And so wind comes in and blows through the tree, and it releases the pollen to get picked up and land in other trees that are around them to land in these other cones. Then what happens, these cones will fall off, land on the ground, and then they'll form new seeds to basically form a new organism. And so these new organisms will grow in the ground from these cones. Okay, so once it gets fertilized, they form seeds, and so the seeds have an advantage over spores because they're highly resistant to drought and predators. Okay, they don't have to germinate right away, so there isn't a time limit on how long you need. Spores need to basically germinate right away when they land. They need to start making new plants, find the water right away, where seeds you don't. You can have a pack of seeds for a year in your house and then go plant them and make new veggies and things like this. They contain embryonic plants, so basically they're suspended in animation. And basically what they do is they nourish the embryo until it can produce its own food, until it can undergo photosynthesis and make leaves. And so typically the first couple weeks while the seeds are getting ready, what you're going to see is shoots coming out of the seeds. And then the first thing you're going to produce is 2 little leaves so that they can start doing photosynthesis so they can produce their own nutrients. And then eventually you see it grow bigger and bigger and bigger. But the idea is to get it established, get photosynthesis going, and then you can get bigger. Okay? So the seed does provide some early nourishment, but again, it really wants to get photosynthesis going so it can make its own food. All right? So now we come to the last seeded plant, which is called the angiosperms. And angiosperms contain all these different types of trees. Oak trees, maple trees, basil, rice, potato, water lilies are all angiosperms. And what is an angiosperm? These are the flowering plants. All these organisms, whether you know it or not, contain some type of flower when they reproduce. Now, oaks and maples may be hard to know that you never really see flowers, but you will see them in the springtime. Basil, you can see the flowers here. Rice, you can see some of the flowers. On the potato, they form flowers. And then these water lilies, here are the nice, beautiful flowers. But all angiosperms produce some sort of flower, whether they're the nice big bloom of flowers, or they might be these little tiny flowers that you see for maybe 2 weeks, and that's it. And that's all you get. Okay? Obviously, the most successful plants. Most of the plants you go outside and you look at are going to be the angiosperms because most of them are flowering. There's over 250,000 species of angiosperms, lots and lots of plants, the most successful plants that are out there. And again, we use angiosperms for a lot of different things, not only for food sources, but we use it for medicine, we use it for clothing, we use it for shelter. All the different types of wood that we might use for cotton, medicine, all these other things that are out there. So angiosperms are probably, like I said, the most successful type of plant. And again, they've evolved to become the most successful because of the ways that they do these things. And one of the most important things is the flower that they have. Okay. Now, what you might not realize is that when you eat a fruit, so if you go to your kitchen refrigerator and you pull out an apple and you take a big bite into that, you're actually eating the ovary of a fruit, or you're eating the ovary of a plant. Okay, the fruit is actually the swollen ovary, and the seeds on the inside are the eggs, or basically the fertilized eggs at this time. Okay, the seeds are the fertilized embryo that is ready to be implanted, and so that's what you're actually eating, is the ovary and then the seeds on the inside. Okay, lots of different angiosperms have lots of delicious tasting fruit, and the reason why they produce that fruit is so that you eat it, you eat the seeds, and then if you were an animal, you go poop somewhere outside and leave the seeds, and then now it has a fresh case of manure along for fertilizer, and so it can grow up into be a big tree out somewhere in the woods. Now in humans, we typically use the bathroom and other things like this. We use the toilet and that stuff. So us eating the fruit and then eating the seeds, we typically just, if we eat the seeds, we pass them, and we basically don't fertilize these things outside in the woods. Maybe you do, I don't know. But typically we don't. Most animals, though, do. Most animals basically will eat everything, eat the whole fruit, swallow the seeds, and then they'll pass the seeds in their feces, and that will provide fertilizer and a way for the plant to get started in the new area that it's going to be growing. Another thing that it provides is a way for the seeds to get transported far from the parent, because typically what we're talking about is birds and insects. They eat the fruit or they pollinate the plant, and what they'll do is carry those things to far distances away from the adult plant. And so that's one of the reasons why these plants produce food. Or fruit. Now, again, some of them are not edible, and a lot of the trees, think of maple trees, oak trees, and things like this. So when we talk about oak trees, we talk about acorns. Maple trees, you talk about those little helicopters or spindle things or whatever you want to call them, and basically the spinners and that stuff. These are all fruits of the tree, and again, they contain the seeds that allow you to spread your embryos throughout the world. And so again, not all fruits are edible, but there are quite a few that are. And typically humans, we don't eat the seeds, but most animals do. And then, like I said, basically it's used for transport to go poop them out somewhere else. Okay? Now, angiosperms we divide into two groups, and we're almost to the end here, and I want to just talk about this. We have two groups of angiosperms. We have what is called the monocots, and we have the dicots, or what we'll see in class is also known as the eudicots. And the eudicots are basically just mean true dicots in that sense. So we'll just call them dicots in the sense. So where do they get the name? Well, basically they got the name from how many cotyledon do you have, cotyledon that you have. And so the cotyledon are basically the little tiny leaves that come out of the seed. Now monocots tend to have one cotyledon, okay, where dicots have two. Okay, and you can see this here in my picture. Monocots have one little cotyledon, where the dicots have two, and that's where they originally got their name from. One cotyledon means monocot, monocot, cotyledon, or dicot, you have two, that's the dicot. Dicot meaning two cotyledon, okay? But there are some other subtle differences that we see, and again, if you look at the stems, you look at the roots, you look at the leaves, and you look at the flowers, we'll all see some differences. And I want to just point these out before I leave you today. Okay, so what are some of the differences between the monocots and dicots? Well, the first one is the flowers. If you look at the flowers and you count the parts, well, monocots are arranged in either 3, 6, or 9. So what does that mean? Well, if you count the petals on the flower and you either count 3, 6, or 9, that's a monocot. But if you count 4 or 5, or pairs of 4 or 5, maybe 8 petals or 10 petals, that's a dicot. And so that's a big difference. So you can go now look at a flower and say, ah, you're a monocot if I count 3, 6, or 9. If you're a dicot, you have 4 or 5. Okay, first difference. The second one is the leaf veins. And so those are the veins that are running throughout the leaves. If your leaves have parallel veins all running in the same thing, typically a lot of our grasses that you see, these are going to be monocots. Whereas if you see this net-like pattern, think of kind of like our blood vessels and how our blood vessels run in that, and you see this netting-like job on these veins, this is going to be dicot. okay, or Dicot in this way. So that's another big difference, parallel versus net-like. The third one is looking at the stem. Now we're looking at what the phloem and the xylem look like on the inside. Okay, so in the monocot, if you look for the vascular bodies, and again, we look in close here, you can see that the monocot has all these different little vascular bodies. And again, the xylem and phloem are these colors in here looking at these things. And these guys are basically the vascular bodies spread throughout the monocot. So that's the monocot. In the dicots, what we see is the typical ring structure. So you know when you chop a tree and you see the rings and you tell the age, that's due to the vascular bundles that you see in the dicot. So most of the trees that you're going to see are dicots in that when you cut them down. Okay, the ring structure. And then finally, the last one is the roots. The roots also have two differences that we look at. Now, here's the kind of funny thing. We talked about the stems and being ring structure for the dicots. Well, in the roots of the monocot, we see vascular bundles and rings, and these rings are pretty closely packed in the center. Whereas in the dicot, what you look for is this little starfish. So when we zoom in here and we look at this, you can see this starfish in the middle. That's the vascular bundle, and so that should be a dead giveaway of the dicot, that starfish pattern. When you see the starfish or the little arms, that's the dicot. The monocot is rings in the root. Okay? Again, when we get into plants, we're expecting you guys to know these things. So when you look at slides on the test, you better know what the dicot and monocot look like in the stems and the roots. The leaves and the plant and the flowers are pretty easy to tell, but the stems and roots do take a little time. So make sure you look at those things and you find a system that you are going to use to be able to figure out what those things are. Okay? And then finally, just looking at all these things again, the monocots versus the eudicots. Again, number of leaves in the seed. So monocots have one cotyledon, okay, cotyledon, where the root has the ring structure, vascular bundles are scattered, parallel veins, and 3, 6, or 9 in the flowers. And this again includes the grasses, the lilies, the orchids, and the palms. Okay. Eudicots have 2 cotyledon in them, 2 leaves. You have the starfish structure, or in the arms of the xylem. You have distinct rings in the stem. You have the net-like pattern in the leaves, and then finally you have the 4 or 5 petals in the flower. Dead giveaways. So really the easiest ones are probably the leaves and the flowers. The root and the stem will take a little bit more time just to kind of get a good pattern down on what those are. And these again include oaks, beans, spinach, rose. Really most of the angiosperms are going to fall in this group. Most of your big trees are going to fall in this category as well. Okay, so now we've taken a look at all the different plants that we're going to look at this week in the lab and that stuff. I know Jill has some other videos looking at how the flowers work and things like that of the angiosperms and the gymnosperms, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what those are. So let's summarize. So plants evolved from green algae. Again, the advantages coming out of the water, basically more light, more CO2. The disadvantages all deal with water. Again, how do you maintain the water inside your cells? How do you support yourself? And how do you reproduce without any water? Okay. First to evolve from the non-vascular plants, it includes the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Remember, go very close to the ground. Vascular systems, the evolution of vascular systems with the xylem and phloem allow the plants to grow very tall. So that's the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. Again, the next step was the development of seeds. So we moved from the ferns, which are making spores, to the seeded plants, which are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Gymnosperms use cones, angiosperms use flowers. And then finally, looking at the difference between the angiosperms, you have the monocots and dicots. Again, angiosperms the most dominant plant type. Monocots, again, the roots, stem, and leaves and flowers. You can determine between a monocot and dicot by looking at those things. So again, make sure you study those things and look at those things really well so that you know what you're to expect. And again, you'll see this on the tests this upcoming week, so make sure you study for those things. Make sure you look at the roots. Make sure you look at the leaves. Make sure you look at the stems so that you have a good idea of what a monocot and dicot are, because those are some of our favorite questions that we like to put on the test. Okay? If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or Jill. Make sure you go through the stuff. Make sure you look at everything and do what you need to do for these things. And again, any questions, feel free to ask. And for that, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.